name is Ben Madley, and I am the visiting professor of law at the Indigenous Law Center. My first book is titled An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, 1846 to 1873. My methods are primarily archival. That means I am rooting around in the archives in places like the Huntington Library in Southern California or the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. But what I do is I gather information and then I go to members of tribal communities and I share the information with them to find out what I've got wrong, what I've got right, and to ask them what other clues they can give me, what kind of breadcrumbs they might be able to provide that I can use to go back into the archives. So for example, someone told me at Smith River Rancheria once that there was a time when all of the villages were on fire. And by thinking about their songs and their genealogical histories, they were able to guess that this happened roughly sometime in the early 1850s, between 1850 and maybe 1854. So I then went to an archivist at UC Berkeley, Susan Snyder, and I said, Susan, what kind of sources could I look at that would take me into Del Norte County in the early 1850s and give me eyewitness accounts? So she had the bright idea that I look at ship's logs of ships sailing between Portland, Oregon and San Francisco. That helped me to nail the year down very precisely. And then I went back to her and we found a first-person account in a book called, I think, An Austrian Gentlewoman's Journey Around the World. And Ida Pfeiffer, the author, actually went and toured this area. And that provided a very granular first-person eyewitness account. So while I'm not interviewing California Indian people and publishing what they tell me in interviews, I am working with them to find documentary evidence in the archives. So I'm fundamentally an archival historian. For historians, it's very important to do fact-finding that establishes contact with as many people as possible who might have ideas about how something happened, so that we can find as many different kinds of documentary evidence as possible to try to understand cause and effect. You can think of history as being reduced in some ways to a simple formula of change over time. But in order to understand change over time, you need to know who the actors were, and that means trying to get as much evidence as possible. Native American studies and Native American history are rapidly changing fields. And one of the things that people have begun to take very seriously in the last 3 to 5 decades is the indigenous archives. The way in which material objects, writing, and oral history produced by indigenous people can help us to better understand indigenous history, indigenous epistemology, indigenous ways of seeing the world that might be very different than the way that history has been presented in the past, history that has been premised almost exclusively upon the viewpoints and evidence and interpretations prepared by people who themselves were not Native Americans. Very often when we look at the perspectives presented by perpetrators and by victims, we learn very different things from those two viewpoints. So for example, in the Bloody Island Massacre in Lake County in the year 1850, the eyewitness accounts presented by the officers who directed the mass killing, officers in the cavalry, officers in the infantry, and officers in the artillery, speaks of course to their direct observations, the ways in which they killed people, how people died. But they're able to tell us very little about how people survived. because the survivors were, of course, the people who eluded their surveillance, who eluded their dragnet to catch and kill everyone. So the military officers don't tell us, for example, that people hid underwater and breathed through reeds so as not to be observed by the killers. That's the kind of fundamental difference that we see when we look at the material presented in cases of mass murder by perpetrators or by the survivors. In the field of genocide studies, in some ways, the gold standard for studying a case of genocide derives from a model in which we seek to get evidence from three groups of people. First of all, people who are bystanders to genocidal events. They're witnesses, but they're bystanders. A second group that we would seek to get evidence from would be the perpetrators. That's the actual evidence produced and presented by people who planned and carried out mass murder. Then the third group would be individuals who are either survivors of genocide or who are themselves victims, but were able to leave evidence of mass killing and the policies associated with mass killing. If we can get evidence from all three perspectives, bystanders, perpetrators, and survivors and victims, then we're able to triangulate and create a more three-dimensional and hopefully accurate representation of what actually happened, because we're able to weigh the viewpoints represented by the different groups of people against each other. And very often those different viewpoints shed very different light on events and provide all kinds of very helpful new details about what happened. So history and law can be intimately related fields. Of course, they have one very fundamental difference that occurs to me right away, which is that historians are often seeking to describe past events that cannot be tried in a court of law. They cannot be adjudicated. Whereas lawyers are often working on more recent history, events that can be taken into a court of law and where a verdict can be rendered. What historians can provide to people in the legal profession is a deep context, an understanding of legal history, of precedents that are not necessarily courtroom precedents, but are nonetheless important precedents to understanding the evolution of policy, the way in which judges are rendering decisions, the way in which policymakers are formulating and making their policies, and ultimately the lived experience of people in the past, as well as the way in which all of that history echoes into and shapes our lived reality in the present. So the genocide of California Indian people between 1846 and 1873 has profoundly shaped the state of California and its original inhabitants, the native peoples of California. One of the very fundamental things that we can look at is the catastrophic demographic impact. When the United States invaded California in 1846 and then seized it from Mexico, demographers estimate that there were approximately 150,000 Native American people living here. Now, more than 150 years later, in 2023, there are approximately the same number of California Indian people living in this state. So it has taken that long for California Indian peoples to demographically recover from the cataclysm of 1846 to 1873. But the legacies of that genocide are all around us. The vast acreage, the cornucopia of natural resources that make California the most populous and prosperous state in the most powerful and wealthy country on earth are fundamentally premised upon this genocide.